I'd like to thank all of you for being here and thank all of you for your presentations. I've been looking at my family tree for about a decade now, and I've come to find some interesting things about myself over the past decade. I learned that I am part of the Tunica Nation out of Louisiana. I also learned that I have parental and maternal slave descendants. And on my mother's side of the family, I have slave ancestors from South Carolina, from the small town of Edgefield, which is, yes, no kidding, well, small world. And it's also the home of Senator Ben Pitchfork Tillman, Senator Strom Thurmond, and Senator Preston Brooks. If the third name doesn't sound as familiar, he's the guy who whacked Senator Charles Sumner with a cane on the floor of Congress. So I've been told that I might be a distant cousin, however many times removed, of Senator Brooks, but I promise to be nonviolent today. So about 4 years ago, I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in The Atlantic called The Case for Reparations. And he says in that article that to him, reparations does not mean white people writing black people a check, but rather for Americans to ask themselves, what does America owe itself in terms of coming to grips with its history of slavery? And the way that I interpreted that article was to try to find out what kinds of connections, especially monetary connections, can be made between the institution of slavery and the places where I live. And I thought that I would start at home with St. Cloud, Minnesota, since that's where I live and that's where I work, at St. Cloud State University. And I didn't expect to find very much about St. Cloud State University because the university was founded in 1869, which is 4 years after legal slavery ended. But as it turns out, since Minnesota Territory was organized in 1849, what that means is that there were people who were able to come to Minnesota and buy land. And some of the people who bought land were Southerners, and some of those Southerners were slaveholders. So what I started doing was going to different recorders' offices, not just in Stearns County, but throughout Minnesota. And for all the counties that were organized before 1865, I would just look through the volumes of deeds and write down all the names of Southerners who bought land. And then I would go home and go on FamilySearch.org or Ancestry.com and see if any of those Southerners were slaveholders. And if there were, then I knew that I had a monetary connection between a Southern plantation and whoever sold the land to that Southerner here in Minnesota. And at St. Cloud State University, there are a couple of lots where the parking garage sits today and where the science building sits today that were once owned by a couple of slaveholders who had come to St. Cloud to visit the land and even go on vacation there, because since it sits on the Mississippi River, St. Cloud was a popular tourist destination site, just as the Twin Cities were. I also learned that the very first campus building at St. Cloud State University was an abandoned hotel, and that hotel used to welcome Southerners and their slaves. And in fact, in 1857, there was a riot that took place right outside the building. There were people who came from Tennessee who had slaves with them, and someone tried to help one of the slaves escape, but law enforcement came into town and squashed the riot, and the slave was returned to the owner. And the fact that it happened in 1857 is very crucial to remember, because even though Minnesota Territory was organized and it was legally a free territory, the Dred Scott decision of 1857 said that a slaveholder could take a slave anywhere in any territory, and that slave could still be a slave. And at the time, Minnesota was not a state yet. It would not be a state until May of 1858. So for 14 months, over a year, from March of 57 to May of 1858, Minnesota was a legal slave territory. And there was an uptick in the amount of purchases of land. in 1857 during that tourism season. After a while, I started to look at newspaper articles to try to see if any of the people who I found in the deeds would be reported on for different visits. One of the people I stumbled upon was a man named James Orr from South Carolina, who had been in Congress and who made a visit in 1857 in St. Cloud. But I found a newspaper article that said that that same year he also visited the Twin Cities, and one of the people who visited with him was William Aiken. And William Aiken was a South Carolinian, and he was from Charleston, and he had somewhere between 700 and 800 slaves in South Carolina. And I originally thought it was 1857. It turns out it was actually 1856 when Aiken came to Minnesota for the first time. And that's when he saw the U of M campus shut down, which it had been since 1854. And he decided to loan $15,000 on the spot, which translates into $500,000 today. And then in 1857, he comes back with James Orr, and it's not really so much a donation as much as a loan. And in 1857, he cashes out some of that loan, about half of his loan, actually. He cashes out about $7,000 of it. So that left a good $7,000, $8,000 left in the U of M accounts. And then in 1862, we're in the Civil War, and the state of Minnesota passes a law that says that nobody living in a Confederate state can come to Minnesota and sue in its courts. And since Aiken lived in South Carolina, that meant that he couldn't come to Minnesota and sue to try to get his money back. So that essentially meant that the U of M could keep the money. And it did, and it's still in the accounts today. They never did give it back. But that's not the only connection to slavery that the U of M has, because some of the people who were early champions of the U of M, like Henry Rice and Henry Sibley, were people who had once worked for the American Fur Company years earlier. And the fur company was led by a group of about 3 or 4 people out of St. Louis. And at least one of them was definitely a slaveholder because his name was John Emerson. And Emerson was one of the people who owned Dred Scott. So those are the kinds of things that I've been finding, and I'm still in the research process. There's been quite a bit of support that I've received from people here at the U of M, especially with Yuichiro and with Catherine Squires and Ezekiel Joubert and others. And I was able to speak at the Social Concerns Committee a couple of years ago, and I also spoke through the IAS sometime last year as well. So I look forward to continuing the relationship that I have here at the U of M in looking at more connections with slavery, as well as trying to see what else I can find at St. Cloud State. Thank you.